Can you hear me? Perfect. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it. So today, I'm going to talk to you guys about model governance. And I've had the benefit of being within the industry for about 10 years. And it used to be, you'd get a model in production, you'd pop champagne, hey, we're done. But really, as the industry has matured, governance and MLOps have become more and more important. And this is really driven by a couple different factors, which we'll get into. There. So if you look at the challenges on the process side for putting a model into production, they're quite numerous. So obviously ML dev, right? You give a team of data scientists, you're paying them burden costs, let's call them $200,000 each, but the business leader doesn't have a model inventory, doesn't understand everything they're working on. They might be working in different modeling environments. So think about the marketing team is programming in Python. The operations team may be in R. Someone else may be using another different technology stack. It's hard to validate when you have a complex system like that. Deployments then are a mess. I worked at a large company, 6 months to get the data, 6 months to build a model, 6 months with IT getting it into production. By the time that model's in production, it's a year and a half old. So what does that mean? It means your model's stale, it means it's not working the way you intended, not delivering the value that you expect. And we're entering this ML trough of disillusionment, realistically, as the recession is looming, that we need to get more out of our data science teams. And how do you get more out of your data science teams? You help clean up these processes, right? There. On the people side, it's very complex. To go from what we call this data to value, or this ideation to operation, you have this long series of handoffs that have to happen. And what's interesting is these people sometimes don't have aligned incentives. They don't understand models the same way. You look at the left-hand side, senior executives, right? They'll be, I don't know, reading the Wall Street Journal, and they'll say, hey, I think AI conceptually should be used in this line of business. They aren't going to really understand a model as they're coding. They're from like a code perspective. So these senior executives, these line of business leaders, they're the AI innovators. They're the ones that say, this is where the technology gets implemented, right? They need to hand off that idea or structure that business problem to the AI creators. These are your business analysts, your data scientists, your programmers. And then, of course, you don't want to live in an environment where it's just bespoke modeling, it's just sitting in a notebook. You actually have to get it into production. So that means you have to involve IT. So you have this long series of handoffs. We call these our 4 personas on the team. So I work in trusted AI. It's all about responsibility. It's all about how do you engender trust in automated decision systems, explainability, and so on. We focus on these 4 personas, the AI innovators, creators, operators, and these consumers. And it's interesting because consumers can be any stakeholder in your organization or outside, right? So think about a call center agent who gets a pop-up on their window, which is a customer propensity model. They're consuming your model. If they ignore that pop-up in their process of trying to wrap up a phone call, then all of this other effort is wasted. So understanding that last mile delivery is super important. Another stakeholder would be like your MRM team, your model risk management team. For certain use cases, you have to be very careful. ML has the ability to have a great positive impact in the world. But on the other hand, it can have a negative amplifying effect. And so understanding the risks associated with AI and what the industry is calling responsible AI is super important. That's usually a different type of consumer that you have to address. So how do you do it? Well, what I would say, is go back 3-4 slides. All right, so what I would say is you have to have an adaptive policy framework. There's no set of rules, singularly, that will mitigate risk across all of your models. So this Swiss cheese method is actually used in aviation. And what it says is you have these series of defenses, and no single threat vector will pass all the way through. And so what does that mean in practice for those of us that are borrowing risk management and safety systems engineering principles and implementing it in ML? Well, you have your people, your business line managers, and your data scientists who are building models. They're your first line of defense when you're actually doing this work. There's risk management. So in large organizations, they need to identify risky models, credit models, human resource models, employment and scheduling models. There's all sorts of historical ML missteps that you have to protect an organization against. And that's the role of this risk management processes. You can also have an internal audit team. The internal audit team actually looks at the enterprise. We'll get into that very briefly. And then lastly, there's regulations. Just so you know, regulations are the last line of defense. It's really the civil contract that your ML team has or your organization has with society. And there's been so many missteps that regulations have to step in and provide fines. So obviously you want to have a series of defenses and think about the people, the process, the technology for each one of your lines of defenses. Now, of course, you want to be more structured and more applicable to your organization, but this is a good high-level way to think about it. So, drilling down a little bit to give you a little more clarity. So that first line of defense, those are your business line managers, your line of business leaders, and your data scientists. A lot is being pushed into data science. It's no longer, hey, let's go ahead and just build a model. Now it's, hey, think about your documentation. Think about the responsibility and the ethics of this. That has to be in concert with the business leader. A business leader who's incentivized to reduce cost may push a data scientist to optimize a scheduler, right? In doing so, they may be impacting low-wage workers. And thinking about whether or not that aligns to an organization's values, that's that first line of defense. Their job is to build it if it aligns to the organizational values, build it and document it. And their perspective is very local. Their perspective is always looking at the model, always looking at what the ROI can be, what the downfall or the risks associated with it, what are the hazards. Moving up a level, your second line of defense generally is your risk management team, your MRM team. They'll look at specific use cases and review. So think of them like graders. They're the people who are going to grade or evaluate a model on some spectrum of risk, right? If I'm doing ad tech and it's a propensity to click a banner, probably low risk, doesn't need much oversight. If I'm doing credit modeling, it needs a lot of oversight. There's regulations. I don't want to be get in trouble for redlining, let's say by race, gender, or some other protected feature. And so I would say their perspective is more regional. They're picking out these larger, high-risk use cases, and that's how they're looking to improve. And then finally, you want an overarching view. You want to get out of the world of bespoke modeling and bespoke tech stacks. If you're in bespoke modeling, you're inviting risk you don't even realize is there. Marketing is not even looking, let's say, they're looking at one set of KPIs. Human resources is looking at proportional parity to make sure their models aren't biased. Okay, fine, but do you have that documented anywhere? And that's the role of the internal audit team, to help establish a foundation of good governance. So what happens if you just screw around, you don't do this? What really happens? Well, it takes a long time to deploy. That was my previous experience at a different company. You spend a lot of time trying to ensure that you can get a model into production. Well, what is that? You're doing this to decrease costs or increase revenue, right? And so if it takes a long time to put a model into prod, you're losing out on money while your competitors are moving fast, right? So speeding up your throughput of these very expensive data scientists is super important. So you create business risk. Operational risk. We had a model, we helped Health and Human Services with some COVID simulations. And when you have a model like that, the ground facts change very often. And you have to have good monitoring capabilities, right? You think about where, depending on who you're following, we're on the precipice of a recession, or maybe we're in a recession, right? But if your model goes into production, it was built pre-recession, and it's customer propensity, how do you know when your model's deteriorating? How do you know when your model's drifting, and so on? And so you're going to have a negative impact there on your financial outcomes, or the ROI for that model. And then audit risk. In regulated environments, insurance, healthcare, there's a lot of opportunity for audit risk, which will result in fines. One of the big things we always talk about at DataRobot on my team, there's a lot of pending regulations. The AIA out of the EU talks about high-risk use cases. They're talking about fines that are up to 6% of revenue. Now, it's not enforced, but that's what's proposed. It's going to be the GDPR but for ML. And they're going to say, you have run afoul and had algorithmic victimization, right? And so we have to be very, very careful of that. So these are all of the risks that are kind of swirling around, and that should be pointing your organization to very specific governance outcomes. Now, this slide is admittedly crazy, right? But, but what I would say is, obviously, you're going to be training, right? And so there's a lot that happens in ML Dev, and that's what we all used to do. ML Dev, optimize, Bayesian parameter tuning, all of it. We have the best model, we throw it over to IT, they take 6 months, maybe they put it into production. The point of this slide is to say there's a lot that's happening, and all of it needs to have version control. All of it has to have proper monitoring for the inputs changing, for the outputs changing. And in some use cases, even not the model in production, but while you're getting to production, how do you think about stakeholder impact? How do you think about people of color, the AI consumers, the different genders, right? There are times when models will inadvertently pick up on proxy features. We did work with Adecco UK. It's the world's largest temp agency. They wanted to be proactive about the AIA, this EU Algorithmic Accountability Act. And they were building a resume scanning tool. And they were very worried because these types of models will pick up on patterns that can represent gender, can represent race, even without race and gender being in the model itself, right? You think about a resume and you have, let's say, extracurricular activity listed, right? Like football or wrestling. Generally, those skew towards male, right? And a model will pick up on that. And if historically you've hired males for your software development jobs, your model will pick up on that proxy information. You have to be in a headspace to recognize that problem. You have to be in a technological space to measure that impact and mitigate that risk, both at ML Dev and in MLOps. So what I would say is there's very particular places where you have to inject proper governance. Here's a use case that I'm pretty proud of, although I didn't work on it, but proud that our organization did. Around anti-money laundering for a large financial institution. And what we did there was actually reduce their throughput, so we were able to get a model into production, find true positives, because you don't want to inconvenience one of your better customers and say, hey, I think you're doing money laundering, right? And start to investigate them. That's costly to the bank, that ticks off the client, right? So you want to reduce false positives. But a model like that has to be done very carefully, right? And so we were able to, through proper governance and with our system, help reduce false positives significantly, so they didn't need as many client interruptions, and they're not using their own banking resources. So we were able to help there. We were able to do it very quickly because our system allows for documentation and governance. And then obviously it has to go through their internal audit team, the MRM team. And what it resulted in was a standardization of the process, improved explainability. The model's in production, so our MLOps team, our MLOps section of the platform has this ongoing monitoring. And my team of engineers actually helped build a system which helps create compliance documentation automatically. And just for that one use case, within 2 weeks, their annualized run rate was a $650,000 reduction in cost. So that's very useful, and that's enabled by thoughtful processes, thoughtful project creation, and robust technology. What I would say here, this is little screenshots of that compliance documentation. In a world where the House of Representatives in the US has passed the Algorithmic Accountability Act, in a world where the EU has passed the AIA, you're going to need proper documentation. And data scientists got into this because they wanted to model. They didn't get into it because they wanted to do documentation. So it's important that you have a robust system that allows them to get the documentation created as soon as possible, as easily as possible, and do it in a way that standardizes it. You don't want marketing using a certain template, let's say, in operations they're not. One of the things that I like about our system, obviously I'm very biased, is that if you build a model and you give us your inputs, your predicted outputs, and your actuals, we can give you your compliance documentation. And on top of that, within MLOps, we have what's called a deployment report. You want your MRM team to be revisiting this as a part of their lifecycle management. Hey, every 30 days, let's pull the documentation. Is the model still behaving as expected? Is it still as accurate as we thought? It's hard to tell if you're blind to it without good MLOps. So if you want to know more, you can always hit me up. I'm just ted@datarobot.com. Or you can check out any of these resources that I think are pretty good. And with that, I'll stop. And does anyone have any questions? We have like 4 minutes between me and lunch, I guess. But what do you guys have? Any questions? What I would encourage each of you to think about is the modeling use case, and think about the process, the technology, and the regulation that could be impacting it, and think about the overall risk. Like I said, it used to just be, let's put a model in production, and let's pop champagne. But I think those days are behind us. Great. Thanks, everyone.